Hey everyone, it's Samuel.
And I'm Mike.
And welcome to Plot Hooks, the podcast where we explore the arts of narrative and collaborative storytelling in the world's premier RPG, Dungeons & Dragons.
Today we're joined by B. Dave Walters.
In the wilds, the vampire.
And in the tavern, what would you do if your party was threatened by slavers?
Alright, let's go. Back again here, Mike.
It's good to be back.
Yeah, excited for episode 10. We've made it to the double digits.
I know, right? It's time.
Today, we're going to be joined by B. Dave Walters. We're going to play that interview that I did with him in just a little bit. Before we get to that, just a couple of announcements to get out of the way. Remember to follow us on all our social media. Find us on Twitter, Facebook, Instagram. You can subscribe to the podcast on YouTube if you'd like to get your podcast that way. And remember, of course, we have a standing giveaway for whenever we hit 250 followers on Twitter. We're giving away a D&D 5th edition book for a lucky follower. Finally, it would be awesome of you if you could support us on Patreon. And we do have a new patron to shout out. Shane, welcome to the Plot Hooks team. Thanks so much for joining us there. And he's going to be getting all the awesome exclusive perks that the patrons on Patreon get, such as interacting with us there. And of course, we're also releasing a lot of the world information for our homebrew world of Carrick, and he's going to get all that exclusive information there as well. Above all, though, your support is just really appreciated because it helps us make the podcast even better for you each and every week. All right, well, with the announcements out of the way, I guess we'll hop right into our interview with B. Dave Walters. You'll recognize him from things like Vampire the Masquerade, LA by Night, the D&D comic, A Darkened Wish, and now his currently running campaign featuring the characters from his D&D comic, and lots more. And we'll get into his credentials even more as we get into the interview. But I guess, without further ado, let's just hop right in.
All right.
All right, so we're here with Mr. B. Dave Walters. Thank you very much for joining us, sir.
That's the sound of the crowd going wild. That's what that is.
Yeah, absolutely. We're very thankful that you took the opportunity to join us. And you, of course, are someone who's been involved a ton in different spaces of this tabletop role-playing game space, and even more in things outside of it, for that matter. But, you know, from the D&D comic, A Darkened Wish, to the series now that's running based off of those characters, to LA by Night, Long Beach by Night, Beyond Heroes, so many different things that you're involved in this role-playing space. How did you get involved in this in the first part? How did you become such a prolific storyteller that's all over our streams?
Well, again, a couple of things. One, yes, thank you for having me, by the way.
Sure.
Two, sorry, not sorry for spreading my own infestation all over the internet there. I've been playing games since I was 13, really. I've been playing since I was in junior high, so I'm closing in on 30 years of it now. I originally introduced a lot of people at Geek and Sundry kind of to each other.
Yeah.
And some friends of mine who I won't put on blast, who shall remain nameless, actually were doing like streaming content without me. And this is back in the days when I still kind of had a day job. And on the inside, in the back of my mind, I sort of was like, man. And then we got Ask Your Black Geek Friend. And the first year we were doing that, Satine Phoenix was doing her Charity 20 stream, and I had an opportunity to go on there and play a little bit of Vampire, and that was the night that I met Jason, and that was also my very first time playing on stream ever. So the Charity 2017 Vampire the Masquerade stream you can see us in was kind of ended up being a proto LA by Night.
Yeah.
But I just knew that I was kind of like, I went full Eminem, that this is my shot. I need to make the most of it. So I went all in with the costume and the voice and all that. And then people were like, oh, he can really do this.
Yeah.
And then, gig, baguette, gig, baguette, gig. And then now I've been blessed to be in a place where I kind of get to produce my own stuff. And, here we are.
Yeah. Um, and part of that, how you dove and still continue to dive so deeply into the various narratives that you're a part of, I think is part of what makes you so endearing and sought after as a storyteller, because of how much you put into your product, whether it be as a particular character in a story or as the game master. The amount that you put into it really shows.
Well, I really appreciate that, and the truth is, I take these things very seriously. I take storytelling very seriously. I mean, on the one hand, yeah, it's just a game. You roll the
Hmm.
dice, and sometimes you're gonna hit, and sometimes you're gonna miss, and sometimes your characters are gonna win, and sometimes you're gonna lose. But the idea that to me it is honestly, and I don't mean to make it sound like too grandiose, but I really
Hmm.
do think of it as it's a sacred trust. People could be doing literally anything, and if they
Hmm.
decide to take the time to invest their time, which is investing their life in taking a trip with us, I want to make sure that that's a trip worth taking.
Yes.
And that hopefully, if they're not going to maybe it's just a manner of being able to take your mind off your troubles for a little while, or maybe,
Hmm.
learn something, or laugh, or cry, or just feel something. And
Hmm.
take a journey with someone,
Yeah.
is always what I'm trying to get across.
Yeah. And you could tell, just as you do it, you could tell that you really enjoy it as well. It's not just a performance. It's that you could see the enjoyment written all over your face as well. What is it about role playing and storytelling in this medium which you find so rewarding?
I love the fact that it is it is almost super improv, in the
Hmm.
sense that, one, not only do we not know what's going to happen. I mean, of course, sometimes some streams have more or less insight. I mean, I find I'm most comfortable when, at least when we sit down at the table, and it's like, hey, do go towards the mountains, don't go towards the ocean, you know?
Mm.
Or, but by the end of this episode, the bank robbery needs to be happening, like, just like some bumpers, and then otherwise just kind of go on and do your thing.
Hmm.
But the idea that we can have clearly no idea how it's all going to play out, and then the dice being a variable, because
Yeah.
even in traditional improv, there is no dice mechanic. I mean, the crowd
Hmm.
might say something you don't expect, but there are no natural 20s, there are no ones,
Yeah.
you know and those beget like really great moments, win or lose.
Yeah, absolutely. You mentioned there just a little bit of uh, the ways you facilitate the role playing experience whenever you're doing it as a performance product, um, as a streaming product. One of the interesting things I find about storytelling through this medium as a whole is that even if it's not something that's ever going to make it out of your kitchen table,
Yep.
it is still something that's done for an audience.
Oh, of
Your
course.
audience just happens to be the other people that you're playing with. It is, to a certain extent, a mini performance every time you pull up a chair at the table. Um, what is kind of your philosophy, um, both as a GM in your roles there, but also as a player whenever you're approaching these spaces?
Well, I will say two things. One, to yes and what you just said. I think every single one of us have stories of things that happened at table games.
Mm-hmm.
You know, like I remember things literally 25 years ago. You
Mm-hmm.
know, from just a certain win or a certain loss or just a certain session or a gag that just had everybody in stitches,
Oh yeah.
um,
Oh yeah,
because
my last session, my players polymorphed a roper into a beaver when they were in the ruins of a fortress, and
yep,
then flushed it down the magical toilet. I
yep,
mean, that was just the single most hilarious thing I have ever encountered. It was
in
just completely out
years
of the
from
blue.
now. Yeah, you guys will all remember that years from now, you know, which is part of the magic of this particular medium.
Mm-hmm.
Um, for me, both as a player and a DM, believe it or not, I'm always kind of trying to accomplish the same thing,
Mm.
which is I'm actually trying to give all of the players a chance to feel powerful, like
Mm-hmm.
they're at cause in the narrative, like what they do matters.
Mm-hmm.
It may or may not be heroism. It might be incredibly villainous, but at least that they will know that their actions or their inactions have an impact. And
Mm-hmm.
so I try to toss everybody the ball in such a way where it's like, here, do a dope thing. Like all things
Mm-hmm.
being equal, I'd rather have an assist than a score on my own.
Sure.
Um, and I also actively try and inflict aggravated feels damage. Like I'm constantly looking for a way to make people cry, not because I just draw power from their tears, which don't get me wrong, as a proud Sith American, I do. But if a person is that emotionally invested, it means they are that present. You know,
Yes.
you can't be scrolling through Instagram on your cell phone and move to tears by something.
Mm-hmm.
So that is one of the like purest metrics for me of just that level of engagement and that they are there
Mm-hmm.
and they are feeling it and it is real to them. And I mean, again, laughing so hard there's tears coming out of your eyes, still valid,
Still
still valid.
valid.
you
Absolutely.
know but as long I'm always looking for to make it precipitate. Yes.
Sure.
Yeah.
Yeah, and do you tend to do almost pre-planning in that regard, where you're trying to think of ways leading into the events that you think are going to transpire in a particular session, and think of ways that you can toss the ball to different players and make sure that each player feels engaged and emotionally connects with the particular story? Or is that something you really just have to try to read the table and figure it out on the fly?
It is about 75 to 85% improv.
Okay.
There's definitely been times where in advance it was like, hey, look, like I don't know if you're caught up on LA by Night, and honestly, even if you don't watch the show, you will not hurt my feelings. But there's a lot of content out there. I get it. But there was a scene that I had in this most recent episode with Jasper, where in advance I was like, hey, Alex, you and I we've only had one time that was just the two of us.
Mm,
You and I need to have a moment and kind of discuss this, and this, you know.
mm,
Um, so let's look for a time to have that, you know.
sure.
But most of the times it is in fact organic and in the moment.
Hmm.
Because I personally actually don't like pre-planning too much
Yeah.
because to me it feels inorganic. I think because that's the joy of the medium, that it's emergent.
Hmm.
The dice and the storyteller tell you what's up, and then there's your moment. Do it.
Yeah.
This. They pulled the pin on the grenade and it just rolled up to your foot. You
Yeah.
know. You don't have time to be like, well, what color's the grenade? No, you're dead.
Yeah,
Um,
exactly.
so I like the more emergent aspect of it. I will say one major difference, but when I'm streaming though, especially if because even with the shows that I'm on right now, because this exact moment I'm blessed to be on 5 different things,
Hmm.
and some of them we have a very hard out, like the Darkened Wish stream we're on right before Critical Role. Like
Yeah.
we need to be done at 7 o'clock on the dot. Like if I have to
Hmm.
stop somebody mid sentence, I'll do it. We have to be done. um, Long Beach by Night is not so much. Like we still try to be respectful of the schedule,
Hmm.
but if we're right in the middle of something very compelling and we go to 3:05 or something, the world's going to keep turning.
Yeah.
Um, so those are things that I try to be cognizant of also. So a lot of times, like the example I gave before, um, Like today, for instance, on the episode that we recorded, spoiler alert, you're speaking to me from the past. But present me says, hey, what's up? I kind of gave them my idea that I was like, all right, by the end of this episode, we need to be tied off on this particular plot point. You know,
Mhm.
so whatever you do, try and be rowing in that direction.
Mhm.
And then beyond that, there was things that I knew was going to happen that they didn't know, and then a lot of things happened that I didn't know. I was
Yeah,
surprised, just kind of, yes and did, and went along with them. So,
sure.
yeah. hmm
Now, how was it when you took this IP that you're so familiar with in Dungeons and Dragons and the Forgotten Realms, where you actually ended up making A Darkened Wish, this D&D comics, even tied in loosely with the Baldur's Gate Descent into Avernus storyline of last summer, I believe, where you mentioned a couple of the characters in there, and I don't want to give away too many
I'm
spoilers,
glad
but
you clocked that, by the way. I don't know. I don't know how many people did. I did it on purpose. Yep. hmm
But yeah, it it's how did you translate, or what was the process like of translating these concepts which we're very familiar with on paper, where we read the player's handbook and we understand the mechanics behind wizards and sorcerers and clerics and stuff like that, and actually translating it into a comic book story?
I love this question, and I apologize because I will nerd out and babble about this indefinitely. So I will try and
No.
keep my answers brief.
Please.
Um, I think one of the things that I am most proud of in my career and in my accomplishments is being able to add some links to the chains of continuity of these stories that I love so much,
Mm.
that I've been able to do things in the world of darkness that are canonical and permanent. Now I've been able to do things in Dungeons and Dragons that were canonical and permanent.
Mm.
And I knew um when Tess Fowler called me out of the blue
Mhm.
and said, "Hey, I have an opportunity to write a D&D comic. Are you in?" And I was like, literally, like the Flash from Justice League. I was like, "Stop right there, I'm in." You know. And by the time we were done with that first conversation, I had the parameters of the story kind of somewhat nailed out,
Mm.
which is interesting because these about half of the characters were, and I can say this now because it's in print in the books in the wild,
Mhm.
were originally World of Warcraft fan fiction.
Ah,
Yeah. So hey, fan fiction can pay off, kids. It is a
sure.
valid medium. So I had some of these like characters and concepts who sort of lived in my mind for a long time. And by the time we were doing the comic, the idea of me being a level 20 DM and high level storytelling being my niche had kind of already become a
Mhm.
thing. And so I immediately knew, just in that first conversations, I wanted to tell this story about these legendary heroes that have to come out of retirement to save the world one more time.
Mhm. Mhm.
And when I knew that I wanted to do kind of a time jumping story showing at different points in their lives,
Yeah,
it just sort of followed logically to like, well, let me weave this in to some different events in the history of the Forgotten Realms.
sure.
And what I didn't even know was the reason why I set the story in the Moonshine Isles in the first place was we've read 1001 Waterdeep stories and Neverwinter stories, and
Mhm.
quite frankly, I knew they wouldn't let me burn Waterdeep to the ground if I wanted to. So I was like, where can I set this that is still core to the Forgotten Realms, but far enough out that I'll be able to like play with it a bit. And what I found out later, well into the project, that the very first Forgotten Realms story ever written was Darkwalker on Moonshae. So much so, it predated the Forgotten Realms. TSR bought it and then made it canonical to the
Oh,
Forgotten Realms.
wow.
So, in my love letter to D&D, I was unconsciously writing a love letter to literally the earliest iteration of the game. So,
Wow, that's very cool. I
hmm
did not know that.
hmm
We have to talk a little bit about my favorite character from the book,
hmm
which is the Kinku Solivagant.
Hey,
Um,
hey.
I I am extremely partial to kinkus in general, but I thought it was just so wonderful the way that he's used in a couple of different occasions as almost like a little bit of a guiding force in how he um, kind of moves them in certain directions or reveals certain things via his copying his voice copying abilities. And it's just such an interesting character to me because you used a kinku, a character who has no voice of their own, to be the voice of reason, and you used a character whose name literally means lone wanderer to bring these people together. And it was just a fantastic use of a kinku in a story, and I just it really reinforced to me just why I love that race so much.
I really got to tell you, man, and this is genuinely true. I'm getting all emotional over here, like you're making my heart smile because I'm like, somebody got it. Like, yeah, I'm like, somebody got it. Yeah, I'm like my work here is done. Like, I'm just gonna like lay down on the bed after this and like fade away like a Jedi. Just be a pile of robes. Yeah, no, it was all intentional. I did it on purpose, and he's gonna show up in the stream. I won't tell you when or where, but
Okay, I'm looking forward to
he
it.
shows up in the stream. Yeah, that I thought it was just and where that character came from, believe it or not, is when Tess and I were right at the beginning of this project and it looked like it was going to happen.
Hmm.
Um, I was like straight up, for your absolute dream fantasy story, what do you want? Like, what do you want to happen? What do you want to draw?
Hmm.
And she gave me like a couple of scenes and I worked them all in. Like she said, she wanted a big bazaar. If you notice, there's that big whole
Hmm.
splash page, and when they first get to Mintarn, there's this like huge bazaar of all this elaborate stuff, and that's the picture Tess put herself in. Both she and her husband are in that shot. Um, and a few other things. And she's like, I just really love Kinku because I really
Hmm.
love birds. And I was like, great, because I kind of need sort of like a messenger anyway. But I'll tell you, I got probably 90 to 95% of what I wanted to do with that story, I got to do. But,
Awesome.
but the thing we got the most pushback on was the Kinku flying, because I
Hmm.
was like, he has to be able to fly because he is the messenger. He is that. Like, he has to be able to show up places. And originally, when I wrote him, I gave him the cloak of bat wings,
Mm.
and we just we were like fighting, butting heads. And then I realized eventually their issue wasn't him flying. They just, for whatever reason, they didn't want him to have that item. Honestly, for reasons I still don't know. And so when they were like, the issue is not he's flying, like, we just need him to do it another way so he could have these things instead. And one of the things was like the boots of flying, the little winged boots.
Hmm.
And I was like, yeah, you know, I'm like, he's Hermes anyway. So if you're
Yeah.
gonna twist my arm, sure, great. Yeah, no, but it was bizarre. And we fought for like a week on that, and it was kind of like the one thing that we really got bogged down in ever in the whole process. Until I was like, oh, it's just how he's doing it.
Mm.
Cool, cool, cool. Yeah, no, change it. Great. Yeah.
That's awesome. But yeah, fascinating character and a great storyline. If you haven't read it, check it out. It's awesome. 5 issue miniseries, if I remember off
Mhm.
the top of my head. And of course, check out the current stream, which is set in between the different time jumps of the stories, following these same heroes.
Yep, it is
Um,
it is a transmedia story, in the sense that it's the one big story is being told in these different mediums. So you don't have to have
mm,
read the comic to enjoy the stream. You don't have to watch the stream to enjoy the comic. But if you've done both, they very
mhm,
much build upon and enrich each other.
sure. I also have to ask, as far as things that you were player characters in, what was the inspiration behind your bard, paladin, sorcerer, warlock freely over on Beyond Heroes.
Freely, my lucky boy.
Yeah.
So here's the thing. Although his luck has taken a dip as of late, but no, he's good. He's good. This is all gonna work out though. I have at this point honestly played so many games and been in so many things and created so many characters.
Mm,
I'm looking for just things I haven't done it
mm,
before.
mm-hmm.
And even if like if you were like, all right, so you're gonna play an agoraphobic kobold who
Mm-hmm.
is secretly in love with the displacer beast, I would be like, yeah, let's do it. Come on, let's go. You know?
Oh
Because I was just trying to do something else. And believe it or not, again, I've been playing this game for almost 30 years. I had never played a halfling. Uh,
wow.
I just never been a fan of the small folk.
Mm.
So I was like, all right, I'll play a halfling. And I was researching like various like weird builds and different ways that have like synergies that you wouldn't think of. And then I sort of like kind of pieced this together is something that you would think would be really bad, but actually does still work mechanically. And it all just kind of hooked into the whole like he was just born special.
Mm.
Like even he doesn't know why he can do what he can do. He just
Mm-hmm.
does it, you know.
Yep.
And it's just hey, it's worked out. And what's funny is I've built all of these like highly optimized, like super hardcore, really
Mm-hmm.
interesting characters, and like the one who's gotten like the most attention is like him,
Yeah.
like there's stuff I can't talk about yet, but like freely has gotten it opportunities that like Victor Temple and no one else has gotten. Let me put
Yep.
it like that. So I mean, him being a lucky boy has like translated over into the real world. Yeah.
Well, that's awesome. He's a great character, and we all do uh, kind of get to that point, don't we, where we are looking for just unique inspirations. Actually, our last episode was where we talked. Me and Zach talked last week about using the absurd to inspire, because one of the things he enjoys doing with his particular characters is taking a particular D&T mechanical trait and turning it on its head and figuring out where that can take him. So one of his characters that he runs in a campaign of mine is he's a dark elf that's obsessed with rainbows. And it just he just takes he just looks, okay, this thing is supposed to have sunlight sensitivity. Well, okay, what if it's the actual opposite of that, even though that mechanically thing is still there,
Mhm.
but what if it's the opposite of that? And I find almost restriction breeds creativity. That's obviously not an original phrase, but it holds true with D&D character creation and just world creation and improv and just playing at the table itself. Giving some sort of boundaries and parameters helps us think more outside the box and create with some more unique concepts that we've never actually done before.
Yeah, absolutely. And I think to give a pro tip to you who is listening, I think one of the things that will make your storytelling the strongest, both as a DM and as a player, is to remember that all of these people are individuals and intelligent
Mm,
creatures are just that intelligent. Um, there's if you ever have your antagonist is doing something that you're like, well, why are the orcs attacking? Because they're orcs. It's like, no, that's a
mm,
bad reason. You know,
mm-hmm,
I mean, are they starving? Like, are they trying to stock up for the winter? Do they
mm,
think you attack them first? I mean, hey, are they orc supremacists that do believe that all the lesser races should be crushed? But it's like, be clear on their motivation, and when you know that it's easy to breathe life into these things and quickly. It's like I talk a lot about the reason why I can be so quick on my feet with most of these characters, especially Victor on LA by Night, because he's basically
mm-hmm.
me. Like if I became a vampire tonight in 15 years, I'd basically have that guy's life. But even Freely, who in many ways was created to be the direct counterpoint to Victor, that I was like, I need a character who will not be a leader and not be a tactician, you know? Um,
Yeah.
Although he still ended up with like stupid high persuasion because of all of his charisma. But it,
Bards.
when you know them, it is very easy to know what they would do. And
Yep.
so you won't hesitate when presented with a difficult choice because if
Mhm.
you're wearing the mask properly, the answer is obvious.
Mm. Yeah, and I think the deeper we are into our role playing, just the better each session is in general. You know, even problems where you see people debate about whether or not to let somebody roll for something as a DM for something that's impossible. You know, like the classic illustration of I flap my arms and try to fly from one cliff to the other, and then you roll a natural 20 and you're like, what do you do? Was well
Gust of wind
the,
carries them across.
well, like the closer you are into your character and your character's motivation and what they're actually going to do, then your the less and less those outlandish situations come up, the
Yep.
less and less that you have all these almost gaps in your storytelling where you have to fudge the realism to make it work,
Yep.
because the more you're invested and connected to who the characters who the character is on in his emotional level or her emotional level, you the more you're going to be able to accurately just role play on the fly,
Yeah.
in a way that's enjoyable.
Well, and there's times that I think the rule of cool is a thing, though. I
Yeah,
mean,
yeah, that's true.
there's times that, because I am very much of the philosophy that the rules exist to facilitate the story, not the
Mm,
other way around.
mm-hmm.
So there's times that, shooting down the bad guy is going to be better for the narrative. There's going to be times that shooting down the bad guy, but he still manages to hit the ejector seat and get away, are better for the story. You know,
Mm,
it just depends on where you're going with it. It's funny because I saw like a meme recently that I very much agreed with. That was that meme where it's like the dude sitting at the table and it's like the change my mind dude, like he's there to
mm-hmm.
argue about something.
Mm-hmm.
It was like the DM screen only exists for the DM to fudge dice rolls to the player's benefit. Change my mind. And it's like
That's
so many
funny.
times somebody should have gotten eaten, and I'm like, guess they miss. The Tarrasque didn't swallow you after all.
That's funny. Yeah, and as we always say here on this podcast, all the things that we discuss are not meant as hard and fast rules, because the
Sure.
beauty of this game is that fact that you can play it however you want, however you in your particular group can tell the best collaborative story that you can, then by all means go for it.
Yep, because
and
it is
and
that a
mhm.
collaborative art. Yep.
Exactly. Exactly.
I would say that to the previous point that it's like a lot of times people ask me what's the difference between streaming and a home game, and to
Mhm.
me, in my mind, there's really one primary difference, that playing at a home game is a social activity, talking about work, talking about the date that you went on, talking about
Mhm.
the Witcher, like all of that stuff is like valid bonding and an important part of the process. Streaming cuts out all of that.
Mm.
You
Yeah.
just get straight to the game, and
Mhm.
ideally as immersive as possible. There's definitely streams that benefit from breaking the fourth wall. I mean, we liberally sprinkle them in my streams too. But for the most
Mhm.
part, when you're in, be in,
Mhm.
because that is how you get the emotional
Mhm.
engagement that we were talking about before. So my advice to anyone that wants to get into streaming seriously is start practicing that. That once the game starts, you take on the identity of that character and you don't
Mm.
come out of it
Sure.
until the game is over,
Mhm.
you know because that level of immersion and experience is what is going to resonate with people. That's what's going to foster the sense of a connection and adventure, because that's all a fandom is a sense of connectedness with the narrative and the people in it and the people who love it. uh,
Mhm.
and that can't happen unless you give them basically something to grab onto, essentially.
Yes.
That's
Yeah.
the difference between like a real stream and people that are playing a game on camera, because it's not the
Mhm.
same thing.
Yeah. Absolutely. Well, I guess one final question before we head out of here. Is there any advice that you'd give to anybody as they're trying to tell their own collaborative storytellers at home, as anything as with all the different systems and things that you've been involved with in this community? What's something that you've learned which you'd love to share?
One, do it. If you're thinking about doing it, do it.
Sure.
If you're thinking about DMing, DM. If you're thinking about streaming, stream.
Mm-hmm.
Uh, don't overthink it because, like anything, starting is the hardest part, and you'll get better at it as you move along. Um, I mean, as DMs, your only real enemy is meh. You
Mm-hmm.
I'm not above banning cell phones at the table unless they're using like D&D Beyond or something, because it's easy in this day and age for people to kind of like zone out and ambiently start scrolling through stuff, especially when they're not the center of attention, which is
Sure.
not necessarily optimal. And don't be afraid to just talk to your players. Be like, hey, what are you trying to accomplish? Where are you trying to
Mm,
go? What do you want to see happen?
sure.
And try to accommodate that. You won't always be able to, of course. Um, but yeah, more than anything, if you love something, I mean, if you love these games, if you love these systems, like lean into it. Like this is the greatest time. This isn't just the greatest time in history to be alive, because it is, but this is absolutely the greatest time in history to be a geek. If you told me
Absolutely.
5 years ago that the things I'm doing now would even be things, I would not have
Yes.
believed you. Yeah.
Yep,
So
absolutely. No, I'm right there with you.
yeah, well,
Uh,
I'm blessed to know, all the major players, and we all feel like this. All of us are like, wait, are you serious?
yeah,
you know, we're like, hold on, let me get this straight. We're gonna get to go where and do what?
yeah,
You know?
exactly.
Yeah.
That's exciting.
Mm-hmm. Mm-hmm.
Um, well, I guess as we wrap up here, I know we've mentioned a lot of things you're involved with as we've gone along, but where can people find you and or support you and your content here on the web?
Well, I appreciate that. If you go to Twitter at B Dave Walters, right across the top is a big old banner with my whole schedule there.
Mm,
Wednesdays at 2, all these times are Pacific. Wednesdays at 2 are as Beyond Heroes on D&D Beyond Twitch. Wednesday nights, at least for 2 more weeks, are as Battlelords of the 23rd Century at 6:30 on Q Times. Thursday nights at 5 is a Darkened Wish on the official
mm-hmm.
D&D Twitch from 5 to 7. Friday is LA by Night on World of Darkness Twitch, and Sunday is Long Beach by Night at noon, also on Q Times. And I run games on my Patreon. So if you want to
Mm-hmm.
play with me and a rotating roster of people that also appear on these streams, it is patreon.com/B Dave Walters.
Awesome.
Taste the
Well,
rainbow.
well, thank you very much for joining us. It's been a blast, and we look forward to continuing to enjoy your content.
Well, thank you very much, and I appreciate you reading the book and plugging the book. Although I guess I should say Dungeons and Dragons: A Darkened Wish, I would say is available at your local comic shop, but every printing sold out.
Yeah.
So but you can special order it. It's also available on Comixology, Amazon. Get it and bring your tissues. But we are
Awesome.
very proud of what we did there.
Yes, yes, it's amazing. So go out and get it if you can get a hold of it somewhere. But,
Wherever fine
uh,
comic books are sold.
yeah. Awesome. Well, thank you very much. We appreciate you joining us.
All right, thank you.
Thanks again to B. Dave Walters for joining us. That was a really exciting interview. Hopefully we'll be able to have him back soon. Please check out all of the things that he's involved in. He's an excellent storyteller and really worth checking out. I guess now we can head over to the wilds.
Is it a dark night?
right, out here in the wilderness at night.
Was this a really good idea?
I'm not quite sure, but we're here anyway. As we mentioned in the interview, one of the big places you can find B. Dave is on Vampire the Masquerade LA by Night. And though that uses the Vampire the Masquerade rule set, it gave me a great idea of an excellent Dungeons & Dragons creature to look at today, the vampire. D&D vampires have a lot of the classic vampiric tropes, combined with a little bit of D&D flair, but there's a lot of just the classic vampire tropes with them. They have things such as the typical weakness to light, typical weaknesses to running water, a wooden stake through the heart while they're resting, the inability to enter an abode without being invited. They can change shape between their vampire form and their bat form. The ability to charm others, bite humanoids, and create vampire spawn, and summon various creatures of the night to fight with it. All those typical vampire tropes are found in the D&D vampires. But there's a couple of little interesting twists that they also have. One of the interesting features, and I guess I must confess, I don't know if this is something that's in classic vampire tropes. I've never heard of it, but I'm not as familiar with various vampire stories as some people might be. But they have a feature in the Monster Manual, which, by the way, you can find them on page 295, called Chained to the Grave. It says that each vampire is kind of bound to their particular place where they must rest during the day, whether that's a coffin, a crypt, or a gravesite, it says. Just reading the trait straight out of the Monster Manual, it says, every vampire remains bound to its coffin, crypt, or gravesite, where it must rest by day. If a vampire didn't receive a formal burial, it must lie beneath a foot of earth at the place of its transition to undeath. A vampire can move its place of burial by transporting its coffin or a significant amount of grave dirt to another location. Some vampires set up multiple resting places this way. It's interesting that they have this specific place that they're bound to where they have to rest. Mm-hmm. And I think this is one element where you can actually take an interesting story point for, yes, because, you know, it's not just fighting this CR13 monster.
Exactly.
It's you can actually do something interesting by trying to affect this creature's resting place, maybe taking away its ability to rest, yes, by removing its dirt that it has stowed away, or trying to do something to its coffin or something like that. It's a little interesting story element that I think you can maybe hook your players into for.
Well, and it's an interesting tie-in as well to the reason vampires can't cross into homes or abodes, mm-hmm, is the aura of magic that a family life builds in a house. Mm. So you have a tie there where, you know, their formal burial magically ties them to this location. And that ties into crossing into the epitome of life, which is a home where everything happens.
Yeah, they're very much creatures of anti-life. You know, obviously they are a form of undead.
Exactly.
But they are more so even than other creatures. They're very anti-life. You know, their desire is kind of against the same desires of life. You know, their whole sustenance is based off of sucking the lifeblood out of living entities. That's a very interesting dichotomy there, which can play nice into a story where you're setting up the vampire as the main villain.
Exactly.
They're excellent main villains in that way because they are so anti-life. You know, you can create great stories where it is a clear battle between life and death, between light and dark, between good and evil, with the vampire obviously playing the antagonist role. They can also be good recurring threats, especially because of their misty escape feature. If it dies, instead of just falling dead, it transforms into a mist as long as it's not in sunlight or running water. And it goes back to this particular place of rest, which we mentioned before, and it stays there until it heals. And depending on where your party is fighting them, it can be difficult for them to actually fully eradicate this threat. And so it can create an interesting, again, main villain where perhaps they come across it a little bit earlier in the campaign in a situation where, yeah, maybe they beat it, but they can't actually eliminate the threat, and then they have to go and actually eliminate the threat in a different way, either by affecting that resting place or by planning ahead and trying to get some sort of, whether it be the sunbeam spell or the daylight spell, or trying to get some running water, or planning in some way in order to be able to fully eliminate this vampire. And so it just really makes for an excellent main villain, not to mention the fact that it's got its own built-in vampire minions and the spawn that it can create.
I also imagine that it can be a great starting villain for a new party to not necessarily fight and defeat early on, but run into. And you can even prepare your party of players and inform them that your characters know nothing about vampires. You have no knowledge, which means your characters are going to have to gain knowledge to figure out how to defeat this enemy, versus using meta knowledge of, oh, it's a vampire, obviously we have to stake it. No, your character doesn't know that. You're gonna have to try different things.
Yeah, and that is one of the difficulties with tropey characters such as vampires, because their weaknesses are so well known because of the amount that they're used in popular culture. And that's an important thing for us as storytellers to remember, whether we're the steward of the story as the dungeon master or we're the actual players, is we don't necessarily know these particular weaknesses. And it can create a really interesting story of discovery as you're having to try to figure out, what is this entity? Why didn't it die when we killed it? And I really enjoy them as the focus of a particular arc of a campaign. And really, even though they are a CR of 13, they are actually formidable foes. I think it's kind of their weaknesses that are built in that kind of brings down their challenge rating a little bit. But, I mean, they already have legendary resistances and legendary actions, even at such a low challenge rating. They've got some damage resistances to necrotic and non-magical weapons. They have regeneration, and of course the aforementioned ability to escape with their mist form.
Well, and another thing that makes them formidable is the Children of the Night ability, which is a once-a-day ability to be able to summon bats, rats, and while outside they can even summon wolves.
Yeah.
So you go from fighting the vampire by themselves, and then all of a sudden these wolves come out of the woods to attack you, and it changes the battlefield.
Yeah, it does.
Makes it more difficult.
They are a creature which you have to be careful as a dungeon master throwing against your party if they have none of that knowledge built in, because they will be difficult to defeat. You have to be careful about throwing them and taking advantage of that challenge rating. If their characters have no knowledge of vampires, they are going to be harder to defeat.
Well, and on that note, a way to introduce your characters to vampires, maybe not necessarily running into the lead vampire themselves, but the vampire spawn.
Yeah.
Minions created by the vampire that are weaker, they have less actions, and none of the major abilities, and are still formidable opponents, but they can be something that's easier for the party to go up against at a CR5.
Yeah, and that's a part of, again, using them as an overarching narrative. You have this whole process of discovery, of mystery, of trying to figure out what these entities are, and then figuring out that there's something that's causing it. It just makes for a really interesting arc. They certainly are monsters which can be just thrown at a party out of the blue.
Oh, yeah.
But I think they're much better utilized as an entire narrative element. Another element of that discovery is the fact that where they're at, it actually has regional effects. Not only do they have layer actions if you're in their immediate layer, but they actually have regional effects in their surrounding environment, which your players can also come across and use as that discovery process.
So some of those effects that I can read straight out of the monster manual is that There's a noticeable increase in the populations of bats, rats, and wolves in the region. Plants within 500 feet of the lair wither and their stems and branches become twisted and thorny. Shadows cast within 500 feet of the lair seem abnormally gaunt and sometimes move as though alive. And finally, a creepy fog clings to the ground within 500 feet of the vampire's lair. The fog occasionally takes eerie forms, such as grasping claws and writhing serpents.
Wow. Yeah, again, not only good visual,
Oh,
yes. Excellent. That's just an excellent story point for a story of discovery and mystery and intrigue. The vampire just provides such opportunities for an arc in that regard. Well, I think that about closes out the vampire. Let's head back out of this wilderness and find some shelter in a lighted tavern.
Sounds like a plan.
Yeah.
It's getting a little spooky out here.
All right, safely in the confines of the tavern.
My shadow stopped moving.
Yes, I'm very thankful. What's the plot hook that we're going to be going over today?
Today we're talking about what would you do if your party was threatened by slavers.
And this is an element of the very first issue of B. Dave Walters' comic A Darkened Wish. And I think this is a really interesting plot device to use, because this is one of the ways that provides a very clear and well-defined villain with no gray area about it. You know, there's no good that you can find. There's no motive that you can slightly understand behind a villain's actions. It just creates this situation where your party has absolutely no second guessing about what the right thing to do is. Correct. As far as fighting these particular entities. How they do it, of course, is still up to them. But it just makes a very clear good and bad situation, which I think is refreshing at times in Dungeons and Dragons whenever you're fighting against other humanoids. You know, you know that when you're fighting against a beast, when you're fighting against a direwolf, whenever you're fighting against something, you're like, okay, this is certainly an entity which is evil and needs to be destroyed, or this is something where I need to do to protect myself. But when you're fighting against a humanoid, you know, a drow or something like that, there's always, I think, a little bit of push and pull of gray there, because both entities, both your party and the particular NPC that they're fighting, have their own motivations and their own motives. But here, whenever you're fighting this group of slavers, it's very clear that this group of NPCs is evil and deserves to be dealt with.
Yes. There's no gray in that area.
Yes.
And your debates become more about how you're going to get out of the situation versus whether or not you should act.
Yeah, exactly. It also allows the DM to throw a very hard encounter at the party without much fear that the PCs are going to die. Because the goal here, if slavers are attacking your party and trying to capture them, you know, their interest is in keeping the party alive.
Exactly.
You know, is not in using lethal force. And so it allows you to create this really difficult encounter to really challenge the players while not worrying about the fact that you're going to TPK.
Exactly. And if you do end up, quote unquote, TPKing, you can have the entire party wake up in the cages or in the slave train or on a different location entirely.
Yeah.
And that adds a whole new element to your story.
Yeah.
You're in a new location. Now you're lost.
Yeah.
Or you're trapped. It gives a chance for the rogue to use their abilities to free everyone.
Yeah.
You might meet new NPCs that you get to rescue.
And that's all part of that collaborative storytelling effort, depending on how it goes, depending on whether or not they get captured or if they defeat them. That turns the story in a completely different direction. That's what makes Dungeons and Dragons and role-playing games in general great, because you don't know how that story is going to turn out,
Yeah.
but you get to tell it, and it can be just a really interesting narrative. It must be said, though, that this is something that I think should be discussed with your players ahead of time.
Always.
Because this is a particular story element which can be very triggering and harmful if someone has had different kinds of traumatic experiences. Mm-hmm. So this is a element which definitely needs to be brought up ahead of time and okayed by everybody at the table. It's always important to be sensitive even while we're trying to remove ourselves from the real world and putting ourselves in the shoes of our characters and into our story. Those elements are still there within our imagination, and it's always important to make sure that everybody is comfortable.
Indeed. Role-playing should never be an excuse to overstep someone's comfort level.
Yeah.
You know, just because it's a fantasy world is not an acceptable excuse if someone is uncomfortable with what you are bringing to the table.
Absolutely. Yeah. Exactly. I think that's very important. That's just part of being a loving person.
Indeed.
is understanding that as a fellow player with the things that you're introducing to the story, and as the dungeon master with the things you're introducing to the story. Well, I think that just about wraps up this episode of Plot Hooks. Like I say, thanks to B. Dave Walters again for joining us, and thanks, Mike, for joining me.
Thanks. It's always a good time.
And thanks for listening from all of us here at Plot Hooks. Of course, me, Samuel, Mike, Steve, Dave, Matt, Zach, Becca, and podcast Pupper Ellie. We'll see you all again next week for another episode of Plot Hooks.